Canada is in such a horrible position geopolitically. I think the obsession with social justice is dead on a political level, especially in the West. There's a good criticism to have of like just bringing in, especially the Indian immigration, bringing in, you know, basically anybody who wants to come here can join the country. But then Trudeau would talk about it as if his government had uncovered for the very, very first time these mass graves, but like they knew it was there for decades. JJ McCullough, my boy, my friend, has helped me so much along the way. Offered me so much fatherly advice.
Hello, friends. My name is JJ. And given that Prime Minister Trudeau only has a couple of weeks left in office, I thought it might be interesting to do a video on his legacy. Justin Trudeau is leaving the Canadian Prime Ministership in a moment of deep unpopularity, resigning prematurely rather than seeking the fourth term he claimed to want, but the numbers suggested he had no chance of winning. And this is a...
Yeah, it was baffling. I remember like leading up to him resigning. It was sort of baffling that he was still in power by the time he resigned. There is which I'm going to look into to try to confirm. I know there was something with Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the NDP, was signing a coalition or signed a coalition, but it was nefarious because Jagmeet Singh's like been pretty anti-Trudeau, especially as of recently. But people believe that they signed the coalition so he can stay, like he needs to get his pension or something. There's something about his pension, I believe. This is not it's 1.25 times speed. It's not 2 times speed. Okay, relax. I like fast information.
A pretty dramatic fall from grace, given that he was once quite popular and certainly a man who made Canada itself quite popular on the global stage. Trudeau has been in power since November of 2015, which makes him the 7th longest serving Canadian Prime Minister ever, and thus someone who provided a lot of Zoomer-aged Canadians with their introduction to Canadian politics. I think people on both the right and the left in this country would agree that he has led a pretty activist government that has done a lot of stuff, whether they agree with those things or not. One Canadian political commentator that I quite respect, former Ambassador Norman Spector, who worked for conservative politicians when he was a younger man and now tries to offer wise and even somewhat aloof takes in his old age, had this to say: Justin Trudeau has been the most consequential prime minister of my lifetime, more so than any of his predecessors, including his father. However, more decades than I have left will have to pass to know whether the massive changes he has precipitated.
It's interesting to see Trudeau as a consequential prime minister, because I think maybe up until the last year, he wasn't viewed that way. He wasn't viewed as a consequential or an impactful prime minister, and I always assumed that his legacy would not be a big one after he left. My assumption was always that he was like widely hated, like just generally disliked, and then would be sort of, in a couple years, decades, remembered by those who were, you know, who saw him in power and for how much he was disliked. But ultimately, I didn't see him like lasting. I didn't see his legacy lasting that long. I feel like now, because of how fast the world is changing, and because of how fast like the first world, politics in the first world are shifting, I do believe that Trudeau will be, you know, not only remembered for what he's done, but also as a product and a final symbol of an era that will soon be bygone of extreme, like, Western university liberalism and social justice. He's sort of the poster child for that. I see him as like a symbol, you know, as like one of the last pillars of that existing before we sort of revert back fully to having a socially conservative Western world.
Precipitated are making Canada a better country or destroying it. And that strikes me as a pretty good summary of the range of feelings you hear people express about Justin Trudeau. And I thought today we might get into some of the reasons why. So I feel like I've discussed Justin Trudeau's biography in a number of videos at this point. So let's just do a quick summary. Justin Trudeau is the eldest son of former Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who is usually considered the most important Canadian Prime Minister of the second half of the 20th century, Canada's Showa age, which he ran the country for a large chunk of. The younger Trudeau didn't initially show much interest in following his father into politics, though thanks to his famous last name, he did spend much of his 20s and 30s as a sort of low-tier Canadian celebrity, active in charities and things. He got elected to Parliament in 2008 when he was 36, and became head of the Liberal Party, and thus a candidate for Prime Minister in 2013 at age 41.
The son of former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau was the frontrunner from the beginning, and tonight his coronation is complete.
Now, this is
an interesting for my generation in Canada. I believe this is a very interesting introduction to politics and Canadian politics because I was in grade 9, I believe. Not grade 9. Grade 11 or grade 12 when Trudeau was elected. So I've never voted. I've never seen, as an adult, I've never seen a Canada without Trudeau as the head of state, as the prime minister, sorry, I should say. And this is the introduction to politics and Canadian politics that Trudeau had given my generation, was sort of like this cool, edgy, at the time, like, you know, as a young person, right? When you don't really care about policy, you don't know what the fuck you're talking about. It's very like aesthetic based. And Trudeau had this very like young, cool, edgy, hippie vibe that I think really, really resonated with young Canadians, and especially like me at the time. Like I don't know. I feel like every 17-year-old loved Trudeau when he was running for his first election, and especially I think this is really interesting because it's sort of, if I can think about how I was at that age politically, and then I listen to how like boomer mega people talk now, I see a lot of similarities. Because if you had asked me when I was 18 why I liked Trudeau, I would have said like he's cool and he wants to legalize weed, and I wouldn't have had many other answers besides that. That was sort of my reasoning. And the Soy Pill, great channel by the way. Go check out the Soy Pill. I love the Soy Pill. I think I want to get the Soy Pill on the podcast. Hopefully, if we can get the Soy Pill in Canada, in Toronto at some point. He's a great like left-wing bro YouTuber, like Jack dude, funny, charismatic. I think he's like a very emblematic of what the left and like what left political punditry is becoming. He's getting in early. I really like what he does. But he had this video recently where he goes to Trump's inauguration, just interviews Trump supporters. And it's the same shit you've seen like 1,000 times. He asks them, why are you voting for Trump? And they're like, oh, he's going to make America great again. Like, they just kind of say slogans, or that they like him as a person. They like his, like, personality. You know, really, really dumb reasons to vote for somebody. But that's how I thought when I was 18. So I think it's interesting to see, like, you know, personally, not to be, like, universalist about this, but that the average, like, mega voter, the average mega base person has the political opinions and political thought of a teenager. I find really funny.
This is something that is sort of forgotten today, but when Trudeau was made head of the Liberals, it was considered a pretty gimmicky move and a reflection of just how low his party's fate had fallen during the 2000s. Under former Liberal Prime Minister Paul Martin, the party lost its parliamentary majority in 2004, and then lost power altogether in 2006, and then declined to third place in 2011, their worst showing in Canadian history. Getting Pierre Elliott Trudeau's politically inexperienced dilettante son to run for Prime Minister was thus seen as a fairly desperate appeal to nostalgia and
This is true. I think Canadian politics were in a very interesting time. Like, Nova Scotia had an NDP premier, I believe, around this time. So did Newfoundland. Jack Layton was really, really big. Jack Layton was widely loved, and he was part of the New Democratic Party, which is like the third. There's like the Progressive Conservatives, the Liberal Party, and then the New Democratic Party, which is like the third biggest party in Canada. And yeah, I really remember this era of trying to get into politics, but like I wasn't able to vote, and I like didn't know a lot about it. And then seeing this opinion that like the Liberal Party was going to run this young, unexperienced guy who basically had celebrity status for the sake of optics, and it was very, very controversial at the time. And yeah, seen as desperate, seen as a Hail Mary when I was a kid getting into politics. But no, it's true. I feel like that's forgotten about. It's forgotten it's forgotten how divisive Trudeau was when he was voted in, but divisive for the wrong reasons, because it was people being like, oh, he either like, yes, he's cool, he's young, he's edgy, blah 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 blah, he's great, he's a great new face for the party, and then the inverse opinion was like, he's an unexperienced like kid, he's like a nepo baby, and he doesn't have the competence to run the country. So it was very controversial, but it was controversial for like not the reasons he's controversial now.
And celebrity and skepticism that it would work ran pretty high. I was working as a TV news pundit at the time, and I remember how popular it was.
We say, what happened to the fat bloke who did meth with hookers? I think he was Toronto's mayor. Yeah, Rob Ford. He died. You know, the first day I moved to Toronto, I went to the house that Rob Ford smoked crack in. There's a really interesting like backstory behind the video of him smoking crack, and the kid who took it and people paying the kid to take the video of him smoking crack. I believe there's a video essay or some sort of video on YouTube that goes through this whole story, but it's a really fascinating story. Like just the drama of the paparazzi trying to get this video of Rob Ford smoking crack. Also, I wouldn't judge him for. I'm not gonna judge a politician for smoking crack, man. That's a hard vice to resist. If you catch my drift.
Was for commentators on all sides to
Yeah,
see Trudeau as a bit of a airhead, a himbo even, someone who was all charms and good looks, but also deeply unqualified and unserious. Trudeau himself even leaned into this a bit, doing publicity stunts like a charity boxing match with a conservative politician that indicated he was pretty comfortable merging the worlds of entertainment and politics. But in the 2015 general election, Trudeau proved to be an effective populist of sorts, a man able to overcome elite skepticism and deliver a simple, plain-spoken message that resonated well with a broad coalition of Canadian voters. He wasn't a great orator and wasn't overly specific when it came to policy, but he preached an earnest message of the need for Canada to re-embrace its historic values of tolerance, compassion, generosity, and good global citizenship, virtues that had been supposedly lost under a decade of stern and miserly conservative rule.
I learned from my father is that to lead this country, you need to love this country.
Yeah, he was very big. He was a blackface Maggie Trudeau was a oh Jesus man. Yeah, I think he never really changed his approach to optics as his leadership went on. He was a drama teacher. I think people really chalk up his cadence and his phrasing to his background as a drama teacher. Very, very much acting, but he seemed like he was going to go in with this like very, I don't know. Do you know how rich kids who are born with a lot of privilege and they don't really check what they say and they think that all their ideas are really, really good? And they think they have they think that they like cracked the universe. Like they've never had to work for anything in their entire lives. And it makes them feel like they say things that make no sense. They say things like you talk to like a rich guy or like someone who was born in money in university, in like a university program. And he's like, life, it's all about like empathy and compassion. Like we just need more. Like they always say like very big, grand, abstract statements about like what things ought to be like, and they think they're so right. They think they're like objectively correct because no one has ever told them that they are unimportant. That's sort of Trudeau's vibe. Is just all of his speeches just seem like so. His speeches seem like he's imagining himself being clipped in a movie. Like they're speeches that like a politician in a movie is like a movie character would give. They're very like unspecific and abstract about like beauty and love and empathy and compassion. And I don't really see, like that didn't work well for him. I think at the beginning it worked well for like a couple years, but especially as things got more serious, and especially last year before he resigned, where it was like, okay, the state of the world is so much different than it was in 2015, 2016, 2017, and to still have this cadence and this approach to politics of like being really hokey and fluffy was really, really, really frustrating. And he seems really, really fake. And I think that like most of his detractors are people who think just like really hate that fact about him. Like they really hate him as a person and dislike his personality. People with like the fuck Trudeau flags who like aren't going, they're not necessarily the most well educated or are going to be like the most nuanced in their takes on why they don't like his policy or why they don't like his party's politics, but they just hate him as a person. Like they think he's like a soy boy hippie. That's sort of the vibe I get.
Love it more than you crave power.
This reflected one of Trudeau's greatest skills as a politician, an ability to elicit trust by appealing to a sense of hope. It wasn't for nothing that people likened him to Barack Obama. When he was decisively elected Prime Minister on October 19th, 2015, he used a line that became an immediate catchphrase of his and a succinct summary of what he hoped to offer, as well as a standard against which his time in office would be judged.
Sunny ways, my friends, sunny ways.
Trudeau would be elected twice more for a total of 9 years in office. And in reflecting on the legacy of those 9 years, I want to talk about 3 specific realms in which I believe his mark was most notably felt: social issues, the Canadian economy, and Canada's role in the world. But before we get to any of that, let us hear a quick word from today's video sponsor, Brown News. Hello, friends. So this looks to be a leader who was shaped by his times as much as he shaped them himself. A classic example would be this idea of Trudeau being very woke, which is a stereotype that I imagine will play a large role in the way he's remembered. Trudeau seems like a very naturally and even anxiously empathetic person.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it, I think, on JJ's behalf there. Anxiously empathetic. Very, very wanting to be diplomatic. And this is what I mean when I say I think he will be remembered as a final pillar of social justice and wokeism, for lack of a better term, that has sort of defined culture in the past decade. Is he's very, like, whoever is going to replace him, whether it be Pierre Poilievre, who is platforming on like an anti-woke platform, or Mark Carney, who just seems like very, straight cut, way more business-like than Trudeau. Either way, I think the obsession with social justice is dead on a political level, especially in the West. And I see Trudeau as being the last, I don't know, like a symbol, a symbol of a culture that has basically died at this point. Whatever you believe about liberalism or leftism or wokeism or whatever you want to nebulously refer to this brand of cultural politics that has dominated the past decade, it has lost its majority appeal, and most people do not feel that way anymore, and it is dead. Like, it is not coming back. Woke is completely dead. Woke is done. No matter what you feel, I think if you think we're still in an era of woke politics defining culture and defining like the majority opinion, you're wrong. Like, it's over. It's completely over.
Way that men of privilege can sometimes be. But he also happened to come to power during an era that some wags have dubbed the Great Awakening. This refers to the idea that American culture became sharply more politically correct sometime around the mid-2010s, lasting until like now-ish. It was a time in which a lot of people became much more hyper-vigilant against acts of racism and sexism, while activist movements like Me Too and Black Lives Matter emphasized the degree in which racism and sexism remain prominent and even systemic parts of our culture. As Prime Minister, Trudeau went out of his way to signal allyship to these movements, often using his talents for the more performative side of politics to make grand gestures of empathy. He was the first Canadian Prime Minister to march in a pride parade. He initiated name changes of government buildings associated with problematic historical figures, and he issued a number of symbolic apologies and pardons for some of the oppressive acts in Canada's past. And yet...
Oh man, I forgot about that. There was back when this is a funny, I'll tell you a little funny story here. Back when the Proud Boys were more of a joke, when Gavin McInnes had started them, and they were just taking off, but they weren't like, because now they're too extreme. I mean, Gavin McInnes literally left the group because it's designated as a hate group now. Before that point, when the Proud Boys were still an internet meme, there is a statue of not John A. McDonald. What is the statue of in Halifax? Barrington? That's gonna drive me insane. Oh, what was that statue? This was a huge deal when I lived in Halifax. Statue down. Cornwallis. Yeah, this statue right here, which at the time, what is this, 2018? Yeah, I was still in school, and this is right by NASCAD. So I would see this statue constantly, this statue of Cornwallis. And there was a big protest against it, and it was kind of like people understood that it was going to be taken down. I forget the specifics why of what Cornwallis did. I believe it was something to do with residential schools. So I don't know, something like some sort of dark, the way like any statue in the U.S. or Canada is taken down for some dark historical past. And there's a huge protest. I remember there was these two guys who were like self-proclaimed Proud Boys who were protesting, and the clip had went viral. The clip of these two guys at the statue being removed in Halifax went viral, of them like they were just very like in the same vein of like arguing with university students who cannot really articulate themselves quite well, and just very like talking to like 18-year-old girls and just like owning the libs back in the day, back in 2018. But this is a big moment, and this is sort of like I feel like really well defines Trudeau's era of politics in Canada, is like these very performative and ultimately inconsequential acts of symbolic empathy, which we'll get into too with the residential school graves and all those the mass graves under residential schools. I think that was a very interesting like blunder in his political career. That at the time, like if you were to critique that while it was happening, you couldn't, like you weren't allowed to critique it. It was one of those things that like you couldn't question. If you questioned it, it was just seen as like you're a bad person for questioning why we're so obsessed with finding these mass graves. But looking into it afterwards, there was a lot of fucking up on how they went about that, and especially how they talked about it, and the fact that even I believe there was one mass grave site under a former residential school in Kamloops, outside of British Columbia, that Trudeau had went and had taken all these pictures, like shaking the hand of the chief of the native reservation. But the thing is, it was all staged, and the chief and the entire community had known that the grave had been there for years. But then Trudeau would talk about it as if his government had uncovered for the very, very first time these mass graves. But like they knew it was there for decades. And it just sort of, it really plays into like, Trudeau was only empathetic when it served him politically. Trudeau just wanted to look good and looked like the kind, empathetic prime minister. And then ultimately too, it's like the plight of what the Indigenous people have gone through in Canada didn't matter until Trudeau could get an optic, a good photo shoot out of it. And then all of a sudden it really mattered. So for him to pretend that under his direction, or like insinuate under his direction that they had just found those graves and then use it as an opportunity to create a good PR moment is, I don't know, just very, very, that was very disgusting. I remember feeling very like, I feel like that's when I really turned on Trudeau. When I found out about that whole debacle, I was like, fuck, this guy is just like soulless. You know, he is just a very soulless, talking head prime minister.
In 2019, Trudeau narrowly avoided cancellation himself when it was revealed that he had repeatedly worn blackface at parties as a younger man. It was an extraordinarily humiliating moment that his...
That's a great JJ edit there.
...had repeatedly worn blackface at parties...
the fucking chime. The chime, I want to watch that one more time.
Narrowly avoided cancellation himself when it was revealed that he had repeatedly worn blackface at parties as a younger man.
That's a genius JJ edit. That's a classic JJW edit.
Extraordinarily humiliating moment that his critics seized upon as a case study in how a lot of righteous social justice warriors often had skeletons of hypocrisy in their own closets. This was only compounded by the fact that Trudeau also had a number of high-profile ethics scandals throughout his tenure, which similarly fed into this idea that being a good person required more than just gestures. Now, Trudeau reserved his greatest social justice passions for redressing the plight of the Native Canadians, a tragic situation that has long been singled out as the most truly systemic form of racialized oppression in Canadian society. In some significant ways, Canada has long lagged behind places like the US and Australia in terms of forging a workable modern system of recognizing the sovereignty and self-governance rights of the country's Indigenous peoples. You could easily argue it wasn't really until the 1990s that this started to be treated as a priority of the Canadian government, and even then only in a pretty vague sense.
This is true. This is like, how many people know about what residential schools are? I don't know if the US had a similar program. But in Canada, there was these schools where they were basically like re-education schools where they would take kids from Indigenous families, put them in these schools that were all Indigenous. They were like on the residences, on the reses, and then they would like fucking, like the kids would have long hair, like little Native kids. They'd fucking cut their hair off and educate them in English and like try to educate them out of their culture. And in the process, there was like a ton of sexual assault scandals, of deaths that happened. Malnourished. Like, it was a very disgusting, horrible program. It's like the darkest thing in Canada's history, I think, is residential schools. Easy. And I think people are unaware how recent this was. I believe the last residential school closed in like 1988 in Newfoundland. Like the youngest residential school survivor alive is like 45. Right? Like, it's so fucking recent. And I just don't see, I don't know. 1990, Nunavut, last federally funded residential school in Canada, 1997. I mean, I'm not going to say that doesn't necessarily mean it was as, you know, I don't know the nature of like the specific ones. Some of them are fucking awful. I don't know if they're all awful, but they're, here we go. Encyclopedia Residential Schools. This is really fascinating history. I just don't think like people, I mean, Canada, we think about this, but we only think about it because of, I think, a lot of the, you know, to Trudeau's credit, and Indigenous issues are a thing I'm very, very passionate about, because the town I grew up in was half a res. Like, I grew up with I think a quarter of my high school or something like that. Maybe like 20% of my high school was all Native kids. So like, I grew up around this very, very closely. Residential schools were government-sponsored religious schools that were established to assimilate Indigenous children into Euro-Canadian culture. Although the first residential facilities were established in New France, the term usually refers to schools established after 1880. Residential schools were created by Christian churches and the Canadian government as an attempt to both educate and convert Indigenous youth and to assimilate them into Canadian society. However, the schools disrupted lives and communities, causing long-term problems among the Indigenous people. The last residential school closed in 1997. Gordler Hall, which closed in 1997, was not a state-run residential school in the same year. Since then, the former students have demanded recognition and restitution, resulting in the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement in 2007 and a formal public apology by President Stephen Harper, our Prime Minister Stephen Harper, in 2008. In total, around 150,000 First Nation, Inuit, and Métis children attended residential schools. Yeah, and some of them were estimated 6,000 children died at residential schools. Records are incomplete. There's 130 in total. The last one closed in 1996. So, like, I don't know. Imagine 1996, like 2 years before I was born, there was still a like re-education school and a cultural cleansing school open in this country that took Native kids away from their communities and their families, state funded, to basically assimilate them out of their culture. It's fucking baffling, and I just don't see. I don't know. It's a huge deal. One of my best friends is a wildland firefighter. This guy's like my fucking brother, dude. He fights wildfires in northern Manitoba. He's someone, if I can get him on the podcast, he's got crazy stories. He's got crazy fucking stories about fighting fires up in northern Manitoba, and he talks a lot about the communities up there that are like Indigenous communities that don't have roads in or out. You know, like they're completely, you can only arrive by plane, and the unemployment rate in some of these communities is like 60-70%. The houses are like dilapidated, and you're talking about like towns where the next town over is like 500 kilometers or like 300 miles away. Right? Like that level of rural. Groceries are abhorrently expensive. They don't have jobs. They don't have money. And the drug use, the suicide rate too is a huge one. The suicide rate is like bafflingly high. I believe Nunavut has the highest suicide rate of any province, or like I think any like territory in North America. I don't know. I should fact check that. But yeah, like the Indigenous suicide rate is bafflingly high. These people just have nothing, man. It's so sad. And I don't know. The solution is pretty. I don't know what the solution would be. From what my friend has said, who is like, he's worked very, very, very closely with Indigenous firefighters in these communities. It's like they want more agency. Like you can't just keep throwing money at a problem and expect it to fix itself. I don't know. It seems like just more freedom to run their communities how they want to be run and not kind of be stuck under the state and under state funding and under the dole, to just let them, I don't know, produce their own income and, you know, live more freely. Because I don't know, it sucks, man. Like it's so sad. It's so sad, like how fucking bad these communities are, and we just let it happen. We let it happen. We don't talk about it. If we do talk about it, it's very fucking like, you know, like land acknowledgements. Like do a fucking land acknowledgement. You know, you're gonna give like some fucking student goes and gives a speech about like the queering of the interior space at a university and opens their presentation like with we're on unceded Mi'kmaq territory, and that's your fucking performative solution to one of the worst plights in the Western world, the plight of the Indigenous people. So I don't know, it's fucking depressing, dude. It's horrible.
Trudeau's government, however, very consciously made Indigenous rights a huge focus of his tenure, prioritizing two principles in particular: reconciliation, or the notion that Canada must honestly own up to its past mistreatment of the Native Canadians, and nation-to-nation relationships, or the idea that Canada's government must conduct itself in a way that recognizes and dignifies the First Nations of Canada as independent, sovereign entities with rights and powers equal to that of the Canadian state. Shortly after Trudeau was sworn in, something known as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released a big report. This was a commission that had been set up during the previous administration as part of a class action lawsuit with Native Canadians who had been abused in various ways by government-run Indian boarding schools. But its mandate had since spiraled into a much more ambitious project seeking to document everything wrong with Canadian Indian policy. The report made 94 very sweeping recommendations, and Prime Minister Trudeau promised to implement all of them.
It is to accept fully our responsibilities and our failings as a government and as a country.
And in seeking to do this, Trudeau's government presided over a rather dramatic evolution of Canadian culture in a way that has made the plight of the Indigenous peoples of this country front and center in the public consciousness like never before. It manifests in everything from so-called land acknowledgements at the start of virtually all government meetings and announcements.
Hi everyone, glad to be here with you in Ottawa on the traditional territory of the Algonquin people.
That we are on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, Anishinaabe, and the territories of the Mississaugas of New Credit.
The RSMP would like to respectfully acknowledge that our gathering and work today is happening on the traditional territories of the Wimuth people.
I feel like that seems like a bygone era to me as well. The land acknowledgements. I mean, people knew they were bullshit when we started doing them, and they were like heavily criticized, and it was just one of those things like you had to do at a university. I don't know if it was an actual like university policy. I just know the university I went to, every single anything that was sort of like an official lecture or an official symposium or something like that, where they would have a guest speaker in, they would always begin with a land acknowledgement every single time, and it was just like, I don't know. It's like, who was this for? That's kind of what I always got the vibe. Is that like, why are we doing this? Like, who is this? Why is this being done? And who is this appeasing by doing it? It was a very, very silly. Very, very silly thing. I haven't seen one in a long time, but I have not been involved in academia in a long time either. So maybe if you can, any Canadians in the chat can attest to if these still go on or not. I'd be interested to know. When's the last time you heard a land acknowledgement?
Schools changing their curriculum to mandate all sorts of new Indigenous history and culture classes.
It makes rich people feel good about themselves. It's a very good, very, very, very virtue signally, just fucking performative nonsense.
A national holiday to recognize the legacy of the abusive residential schools. Trudeau, of course, wasn't directly responsible for everything that's been done in Canadian society in the name of honoring the 94 recommendations. But as head of the country, he definitely chose to invest a lot of his political capital into giving the report's recommendations a revered status in Canadian society. And the consequences of his choosing to do this have in some ways changed the day-to-day character of Canada the most. Beyond the rise of a lot of new symbolic gestures of atonement and commemoration, the nation-to-nation idea has also changed the way a lot of public policy is made in Canada. The notion that Indigenous governments must be consulted before their treaty lands, or in some cases lands they simply hold traditional claim to, can be used by outsiders, became much more enshrined in Canadian law under Trudeau, as well as enforced by a number of consequential court rulings by judges that Trudeau appointed. This has proven to be most significant in the realm of the Canadian natural resource economy, just because things like mines or pipelines are often located in very remote parts of the country, where Indian reservations or land claims are located. The optimist would say that this means that Indigenous Canadians will now be much more actively included in the development of their lands in a way that will ultimately benefit their often struggling communities, while the pessimistic take would emphasize the degree that a lot of native governments are obstinate or obstructive or radical, meaning Trudeau has simply empowered a new regressive force to hold the Canadian economy back, which might be a good transition to talking about the Trudeau-era Canadian economy in general. There's no great way to spin this. The Trudeau years have not exactly been a golden age of Canadian prosperity, according to most traditional indicators. Under Trudeau, Canada's GDP growth per capita was the lowest of the G7 industrialized economies, and Canada's unemployment rate has consistently remained the third highest. Inflation also rocketed to its highest levels in decades during the Trudeau years, which forced the Bank of Canada to raise interest rates to 20-year highs in response. In one of the most notorious broken promises of his administration, Trudeau was not able to balance the budget through steady economic growth, and instead doubled the national.
Oh man, I don't know if JJ is as aware of his great comedic timing with edits.
Was not able to balance the budget through steady economic growth, and instead doubled the national debt.
Just the fucking boings and the drum hits and the dramatic, it's so good.
Through record levels of deficit spending. To be fair to Trudeau, a lot of this can be attributed to the COVID-19 pandemic, which broke out a few months into his second term and caused years of severe economic hardship in countries all over the world. Like most world leaders, Trudeau's government responded to the crisis with a lot of stimulus spending to compensate for job and profit losses among Canadians whose jobs or businesses had been destabilized by anti-COVID lockdowns, which in Canada were mostly imposed by the provincial governments. The degree that Trudeau, or indeed any world leader, deserves to be blamed for the ensuing state of the post-COVID economy is a pretty active debate in a bunch of countries, but it has certainly turned a lot of voters sharply against their governments.
Yeah, I think during COVID, I was more... At the time, I was like far more like libertarian, and I was really angry about COVID policy at the time. I find now I have a bit more empathy towards what happened during COVID. I just think I didn't take into account the uncertainty of the situation, and I think that I think maybe because I've dealt with so many sort of right-wing people who seem to blame every folly of COVID on individuals and like nefarious motivations. I don't agree with that anymore. I do think it was just like a lot of the nonsense was just like the unprecedented trying to figure out what to do and like what's going on. How much blame hold the fact that Canada's under ice for half a year? I blame Trudeau for fucking winter, dude. Land acknowledgements are still a thing. I was in uni less than a year ago. Damn, that's fucking. Dude, that's like nostalgic. I want to hear land acknowledgement now. That's like so nostalgic. It reminds me of my academia days. 3 weeks of 3 years to flatten the curve. Yeah, like it's just. I know, dude. I remember there was Halifax has this big park called the Halifax Commons in the center of the city, and it's literally a giant field. Like it's a giant field in the north end of Halifax, and there's paths that go through the field, and it like creates an X pattern. And there was when COVID started, they had put up barriers so you couldn't actually go onto the field. You could only walk in the paths because you weren't allowed to do anything recreational. And I remember like watching that happen and be like, okay, how does that make sense? Like if you were going to have to fucking like block off paths so that you can only stay on the paths but you can't social distance in the middle of a field was ridiculous. I remember my friend was playing soccer by himself and got a ticket. It was so silly. He was like playing soccer by himself in a field. Like he was like kicking a ball into a net by himself, and a cop came up and gave him a ticket for being outside and being in a public park because you weren't allowed to be in like public spaces. There's absolutely fucking ridiculous nonsense. I do think it gave an opportunity for people with no power and people with no meaning in their lives to all of a sudden have a sense of meaning. And I think that was the biggest issue, is like the social contagion of like snitching on your neighbors or snitching on your friends, or trying to enforce some authority that is now laid upon you because of the circumstances of the world. I noticed that happen a lot. I've dealt with so many fucking just like angry security guards or like workers. I remember one time I was walking, they had the arrows on the ground to walk down the aisle the correct way, and I was walking the wrong way down the aisle, and this fucking liquor store cashier started screaming at me, and she was like, "You're what's wrong. You're the reason thousands of people are gonna die is because you won't behave." Like she had this big impassioned rant. I'm like, yo, like you've been a cashier for 15 years, and this is like the most important thing that's ever happened to you. I got that vibe very, very, very clearly. Yeah, it was so, I don't know. And the cops too, dude. The cops are so fucking annoying. Just giving people who don't deserve power, more and more power to enforce like draconian lockdowns and curfews is fucking insane.
There are other realms where Trudeau's economic policies have been more clearly his own ideas, however. His efforts to combat climate change would be a big one. Trudeau was hardly some degrowth radical, but he did say quite loudly and often that he believed climate change was a serious enough threat to deserve becoming a mandatory part of Canada's economic decision-making. In other words, government should use its power to discourage economic activity that thoughtlessly increases Canada's carbon emissions, which are already some of the highest per capita in the world. In practice, this included passing laws demanding much higher standards of environmental compliance for the construction of things like pipelines and mines, and even more controversially, the creation of a punitive carbon tax to be imposed on both the cost of gasoline and all businesses that emit CO2.
This is a huge deal in Canada, the carbon tax. I believe, so Mark Carney and Chrystia Freeland, who are the two frontrunners to take over the Liberal Party after Trudeau steps down, are both platforming on getting rid of the carbon tax. And then Pierre Poilievre's slogan of his fucking campaign for 2 years has been "Axe the tax." Like, this is one of the most widely disliked policies I've seen in Canadian history. And I just think it was ultimately, like, it just punishes the consumer, you know? There's a rebate that comes out, but it's very ineffective. And it was just seen as like I don't think getting rid of it will do much for prices of anything, but there's going to be it's very performative. Like, it's a very performative, like, easy dub to get rid of the tax. I think the idea of implementing the tax was just like so disrespectful to the average person who is like, you know, the fucking random like $40K a year factory worker in rural Canada who's like driving to work, getting groceries at Loblaws on the way home, and then all of a sudden is now punished for driving and partaking in like the transfer of goods. It was just, I don't know, people felt very disrespected by it. And I think optically it was just a horrible idea, even if I don't know how actually consequential it's going to end up being. But yeah, just I don't know, disrespectful. People were offended by it.
Common sense that if you put a price on something you don't want, pollution, people will pollute less.
None of this was very popular, and it almost certainly played a role in both Canada's stagnant economic growth and the rising cost of living that occurred during Trudeau's tenure. His Conservative opponents have made particular hay from this idea that a carbon tax winds up being a tax on everything, given how many consumer goods require CO2 emissions to make or gasoline to deliver.
The only thing he's doing
is
making life more expensive for you.
This guy came into my work one time. This guy came into my fucking bar, Andrew Scheer. This guy was fucking hated. No one liked this guy because everyone hated Trudeau, but he wasn't. When during this election, I believe the 2019 election, Trudeau was so widely hated, but he wasn't. Was the election 2019, 2020? Oh, thank you. Glad you like my rings. He was so widely hated, not to the extent that he's hated now, but he was still very widely hated. And I think it was very up in the air whether he would get voted out or not. And the Conservative Party's brought this fucking guy in who was just like a fucking doughboy, weird Christian conservative who was like just the most boring milquetoast, like not even a Trump type, just the most like old stock Canadian conservative you could fucking get. And they were so behind the times. And he lost like by a landfall. Or not by a land. I think they have a minority government. I forget how this election panned out. I don't remember it very clearly. I believe I watched it at my house and was super drunk. But yeah, no, this guy was fucking ridiculous.
You.
But on the other hand, Trudeau's supporters would say that this also illustrates some of the practical difficulties in trying to appease a public who say they want to see action taken against climate change, but also don't want to make any personal sacrifices along the way. Trudeau's other big controversial initiative was immigration, the realm of government policy featuring perhaps the most contentious intersection of culture and economics. Now, when you read the Canadian newspapers these days, you will often come across editorials that attack Trudeau for breaking Canada's supposed immigration consensus. This is a term that certain big shot Canadians like to use to refer to the fact that immigration has historically been less controversial in Canada than other places, or at the very least, uncontroversial enough to not be a front-of-mind concern for voters. Now, this is a complicated theory, and I don't.
This is true. This is so true. It is really, yeah. There is like there was such a consensus. Like I didn't grow up thinking about immigration the way Americans do. I don't think any Canadian really does grow up thinking about, or did grow up thinking about immigration as this negative, dogmatic issue to fight about in politics. Immigration was so well functioning. We had a really good system of like, you know, the people who are here like really deserve to be here. They really helped the economy. And this idea of like, you know, the world's best being Canada's best, right? Like this, our cities function off of like good immigration. And Toronto is the most multicultural city in the world. And rightfully so. I think it's a good thing. Like it's good to have this level of, it's like multiculturalism of people that like have common decency and respect and deserve to be in the country. And now that it's weird seeing going from that era of Canada to immigration being sorry, got a text. I got to read. Sorry. Yeah, immigration going from being this thing that wasn't a big issue to being a massive like campaigning issue where everyone's talking about immigration, like Indian immigration. My famous award-winning video, as JJ would say, on Canadian immigration. Go check it out. The Canadian-Indian immigration crisis explained. Because yeah, it's such a big issue now. It's such a big issue, and it was never an issue before. So I would agree with that Trudeau really broke down the immigration consensus because, yeah, I don't know, the amount of blatant, I mean, sometimes, you know, reactionary, but it comes from a sense of, it comes from a genuine place of concern. Just the reactionary anti-immigration opinions you see in Canada now are totally brand new. That's a brand new consensus that didn't exist before because of Trudeau.
I don't know if I totally buy it, but it would be certainly accurate to say that immigration was not treated as a controversial issue by the Canadian news media or the political parties until the latter Trudeau years, and the criticism tended to revolve around two arguments. Canada's overall immigration intake got too high, and the quality of immigrants got too low. That second point is obviously a controversial thing to say, but when we talk about immigrant quality in this way, we are speaking in a narrowly self-interested economic sense. The legend has always gone that Canada has historically had an immigration system that was very targeted towards upwardly mobile middle-class immigrants, and this has allowed Canada to develop a large and respectable population of good middle-class families from places like India, Korea, China, and the Philippines over the last 4 decades or so. The idea was that Canada had a very strict and picky immigration policy, so even if the country's overall immigrant intake was quite high, it was uncontroversial because the immigrants were all bank tellers and furniture salesmen and real estate agents and things like that. Again, the reality was much more complicated, but that was the patriotic myth. What is objectively true, however, is that under Trudeau, Canada's immigration rate increased to record highs, which was significant because we'd already reached a 50-year high under the previous Conservative government. Trudeau was a big fan of immigration as something key to Canada's identity as a diverse and inclusive country.
Our country is strong not in spite of our differences, but because of them.
Mac Antonio, that's a good point. I think the economy gets bad. I think when the economy gets bad, people start having issues with immigration. Pressure on the pocketbooks adds pressure everywhere else. Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it's a twofold issue. It's an easy target to blame new immigrants when things are overall getting worse in the country, and there is a good criticism to have of like just bringing in, especially the Indian immigration, bringing in, you know, basically anybody who wants to come here can join the country. And if you look at the crime syndicates in Brampton and in North York outside of Toronto, the car theft gangs, the theft rings that exist now in the country, it is mostly Indian immigrants, because they're not coming here well skilled or well prepared to function in the country. They're not coming with a lot of money, and they're coming plentifully. So when you have, you know, a rising crime rate, a lower standard of living, you have an easy target, and then also bringing in too much from one group is a huge deal. Like, every country is just going to end up disliking its biggest majority of immigrants, and in Canada it's Indians. So when you're just seeing, you know, things are getting worse, you're seeing new faces everywhere, just on the ground, day to day, it's easy to direct that anger towards a group of people. And I don't know, sometimes I think there's something to be said about that. It's not misplaced. I think people are rightfully, as I am, rightfully angry about how immigration has been destroyed in this country over the last 5 years.
But for this reason, he was also prone to framing it as something that should be guided by Canadian cultural values as much as economic interests. So in addition to overall higher numbers, the amount of immigrants we let in on visas other than green cards, or what we would call PR, also rose quite dramatically, with a big influx of refugees, foreign students, and so-called temporary foreign workers. And these were classes of immigrants that were easy to dislike from all sorts of ideological directions. Their value to the Canadian economy was much less obvious, since they were either working in some of the least dynamic sectors of our already stagnant economy, if they were working at all, as well as being prone to exploitation by some of the more avaricious sectors of that economy, like minimum wage manual labor and scam community colleges. But a larger societal tension also emerges when immigration rates get too high, and it doesn't have to involve any of the traditional anxieties about immigrants being weird or criminals or whatever, although that's obviously also been present too. Canada is already a very urban country, with population centers that can be quite dense and crowded, so there becomes an unavoidable struggle for space and resources when the population rises at a rate faster than the social infrastructure can keep up with. This includes things like hospitals and public transportation and schools, as well as Canada's most fought-over resource of them all, affordable housing. Some of the global turmoil that overlapped with Trudeau's tenure probably played a role in turning a lot of Canadians off immigration as well, with diaspora politics starting to become a much more commonly shared anxiety, especially in relation to religious tensions in India and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is probably a good segue into our...
It's interesting too if you look at all the research I've done into the Khalistan movement in Canada and the Indian immigration in Canada. Right? If you look at these big ethnic movements from these countries, so the Khalistan movement, for example, is Punjabs and Sikhs in India want their own state, Khalistan, where like it's like a specific like a Punjab state, or sorry, it's like a secession. It's for like a country, like a secessionist movement in India proper. It's not a big deal. It was in like the 70s and the 80s and 90s, but it's not a huge deal. Here, it's a massive deal because people, like as people immigrate to new countries, as people immigrate to new countries, they get more into their local politics as a sense of identity. And I felt this with myself. Like I feel, you know, obviously when I lived in Nova Scotia, I didn't have as much like cultural stock or like civic nationalism for being Nova Scotian as I do in Ontario. I think it's just a natural consequence of relocating to a new place. You hold on to your previous identity as like a part of who you are. So by extension, you get a lot of diaspora communities who end up get really into their like country's politics, and to a point where it becomes like violent. I mean, there's literal riots between Punjabs and Hindus in Brampton and in Surrey in British Columbia, both huge population centers for Indians in Canada. And it's because, yeah, it's just a natural consequence of having, you take a bunch of, sounding a separatist.
You're sounding like a separatist.
No, Nova Scotia wouldn't do well on its own. Nova Scotia could not be its own country, sadly. Although I'd love it. I'd love it if I could go to my own country of Nova Scotia. We are culturally distinct. But where was I? Yeah, you get a bunch of Indians. They band together in their new country. They're just bound to get more radicalized into their country's politics than they would if they were in India. I think you could do this with any group. If you took 100,000 Americans and stuck them in India, I'm sure they would do the same thing. I'm sure the American diaspora, secessionist national divorce community, if that existed, if such a thing existed in India, would be a huge deal. Would be very significant. But it's just, I don't know. It's the way these things. It's the way these things go, right? It's the way these things go. So I don't know. It's again an issue with bringing in a bunch of people from one country and plotting them in your country is that these things are just bound to happen.
Our final chapter, global affairs. Foreign policy proved to be a surprisingly dominant theme of the Trudeau administration in a way that is pretty unusual for Canadian politics. At the best of times, Canadian prime ministers can only really aspire to influence world events at the extreme margins and probably not be particularly noticed when they do it. Canada's diplomatic relationships, likewise, tend to be extremely stable and generally reflect the broad consensus of the Western world as opposed to uniquely Canadian priorities. All of this proved to be much less the case during the Trudeau years. The biggest part of this story is probably just Trudeau's personal fame as one of the world's most recognizable and well-known politicians. Many years from now, I suspect that Trudeau will remain one of the most iconic world leaders of this particular period of history, similar to how we might think of Margaret Thatcher as being an iconic leader of the 80s, or Indira Gandhi as being an iconic
it just dropped for a sec. I think we're back.
Leader of the 70s.
You're
and I think much of
like
this is just because Trudeau is a very distinctive
Positive
and interesting individual.
Thank you for the $2 there, Roe v. Wade.
We often see heads of state who are as handsome and youthful in the way that he was, and as comfortable with celebrity in the way that Trudeau had learned to be after a lifetime in the spotlight. The foreign press similarly really enjoyed framing Trudeau as a kind of arch liberal at a time when right-wing populist movements were gaining power in other countries. This allowed Canada to be presented as a sort of interesting outlier, a significant and even inspiring force of resistance to global trends. I personally think that this gives Trudeau too much credit, just because he is so fundamentally a product of Canadian domestic politics and a man who historically displayed very little interest in political developments outside of his own country. But even so, Canada's international image undeniably benefited from the heroic Trudeau narrative, at least in the short term and at least among foreign progressives. The second half of the story, however, is that Trudeau's management of Canadian foreign policy overlapped with a number of pretty high-profile diplomatic crises.
This is a great, I think that this is a great analysis here too. Is Trudeau was he did put Canada. I don't want to say put Canada on the map because that's being extremely overstated, but he did put Canada in the global conscious of just being a good face for the country and being emblematic of what Canada represented in the late 2010s. But I think, as JJ's about to say, like I said before, he never changed his strategy. And I think that quickly turned from being a charismatic, handsome leader of a country that is, became known globally as a kind, charismatic country. He never broke that way of behaving. And now it just makes him seem like a fucking, the biggest phony on the goddamn planet. It makes him seem so fake. And as tensions rise globally, was Trudeau the guy who would fall downstairs as an opener with diplomats? Yeah, he was. I'll play that video after the JJ video is done. But yeah, he had this his party trick of falling downstairs.
Crises that ultimately served to isolate Canada in various ways and make Canada's foreign relationships more idiosyncratic than they had been in a very long time. Relations with Modi's India steadily worsened during Trudeau's tenure, as India began to view Canada's large population of Sikh fundamentalist immigrants as a national security threat, which they accused Canada of ignoring. I made a whole video about this. It is a pretty wild story. Trudeau had high hopes for closer ties with China under President Xi, but relations instead deteriorated after a long hostage crisis with 2 detained Canadians and accusations of Chinese interference in Canada's last 2 elections. Relations with Donald Trump's America, meanwhile, were initially relatively good, with the NAFTA trade agreement which is critical to Canadian prosperity, being successfully renegotiated during Trump's first term. But for what seems like primarily ideological reasons, Trump really grew to hate Trudeau by the time he came back to power earlier this year. And Trudeau is now leaving office with Trump threatening monstrous, vindictive tariffs against Canadian exports. In all three of these cases, you can make the argument that Trudeau was mostly a victim of belligerent foreign leaders, with Canada at some level destined to suffer at the hands of these governments one way or another. But it's undeniable that he routinely looked weak, and by nature of his temperament and background, he seemed distinctly ill-equipped to deal with a world increasingly run by nationalistic strongmen. So obviously, this is just a relatively brief overview of aspects of the Trudeau years that I personally find to be the most consequential and important. Other people might focus on other things, including some stuff I didn't really discuss at all, including some of his media regulation initiatives, his dealings with Quebec, his drug policies, the debates surrounding vaccine mandates, and the degree he did or didn't improve the quality of Canadian democracy. In any case, when I personally reflect back on the Trudeau years, I think of a mostly stagnant time for Canada, a time defined not just by a weak economy and the trauma of COVID, but also growing political polarization and increasing cultural pessimism. While Trudeau did enjoy some early popularity, it's important to realize that he was never elected by very large margins and actually wound up getting re-elected by the smallest margin of any prime minister in Canadian history.
Damn, dude.
Early popularity, it's important to realize that he was never elected by very large margins and actually wound up getting re-elected.
That's fucking wild, dude. 32%. That's fucking so low, dude. It's really frustrating how much I think so much American, flip that down a little bit there. So much American politics is the American consensus on Canada is so dictated by vibes, and conservative Americans seem to hate Trudeau so much, rightfully so, but they end up by extension pigeonholing Canadians as like weak people who voted for a weak man, which I've dealt with personally, talking to Americans who just assume that everyone in this country loves this guy that is so widely hated by conservative Americans. Which, like, you know, I've never voted for Trudeau. Like, I've never written Trudeau on a ballot. I don't know anybody who has, unless it was like the very first election when they were very, very young. So it's I don't know. It's frustrating to deal with, just like trying to explain to people that you didn't vote for this guy and that you don't like this guy and that this guy does not represent the consensus of Canadian culture the way that he's kind of pinned to do so. That's a very annoying, I don't know. Out of all the things that annoy me about Trudeau, the cultural impact of him is frustrating.
By the smallest margin of any prime minister in Canadian history. On some level, Trudeau never really accepted this, and he often spoke in this very self-satisfied, sanctimonious way that seemed oblivious to the degree he was out of touch with much of the country. The infamous anti-Trudeau truckers protests that occupied the Canadian capital in 2022 and had to be forcibly dispersed with emergency powers was definitely a low point of his tenure, just given what it exposed about how ugly and divisive Canadian politics had become. I am now old enough to have seen multiple Canadian prime ministers come and go, and Trudeau's departure definitely feels like a darker moment than most. Partially, this is because his resignation has been very drawn out, which I made a whole other video about. Partially, this is because of the ongoing crisis with Trump. But also partially, it's just because politics and the state of the world just feel bleaker in general. I don't think that Justin Trudeau is likely to be remembered all that positively in the long term. Despite his generally upbeat persona, I think he'll probably be seen as a mostly divisive figure, someone who contributed to the polarization of this era rather than doing much to mitigate it. But at the same time, I do think that early Justin Trudeau, Sunny Ways Justin Trudeau, will probably be seen as embodying something enviable. You know, that brief moment where Canadians felt cautiously optimistic about the potential of the post-2015 world, an era that back then still seemed exciting and uncertain. But of course, I want to hear what you guys think. What do you think Trudeau will primarily be remembered for? What role will he play in the long-term memory of Canada and indeed the world? Let me know in the comments, and next week I will have a new exciting video for you all about whoever Canada's next prime minister winds up being.
Damn. Yeah, there we go. We gotta wait for the next video. Does JJ? No, JJ does not put on an accent. He does just sound like that. I've never heard him talk otherwise. I believe it's he has like Dutch descendancy. I believe it's from his like extended family, and like a Dutch accent that he gets it from. But I know it's a real accent. It's not fake at all. Just use facial symmetry to assign visa points. Yeah, we only brought in hot immigrants. That would fix everything. So there we go. Another classic JJ video. Out down the chute. I don't know. It is a very. I think people are so done with Trudeau People are so dumb with the Liberal Party. And it is very drawn out. I think most, like when Trudeau resigned, right? When Trudeau resigned, you would think there would be this huge moment where everyone was kind of like giddy and excited that he resigned. And I remember waking up that morning and seeing the press conference. Like I remember like walking to work. Sorry, I was walking to the studio here from my apartment, and I was listening to the press conference of him resigning through my phone. And there's this crossing guard that I always chat with who like knows me because I just the neighborhood I live in. And I was talking to chat with the crossing guard. I'm like, how you doing, man? He's like, it's a great day, man. Trudeau resigned. And there was sort of this like national unity and this national excitement of Trudeau resigning that didn't last. Because I think it's just so drawn out. And we're now realizing we're going to be stuck with a new fucking Liberal PM who is going to, then might lose to Pierre Poilievre. And Canada is in such a horrible position geopolitically for how fucked up the world is right now. And we're sort of realizing like, fuck, we don't have bargaining chips. We don't have a place at the table. We have no power. No one really cares about our opinion. And like nothing we do is consequential. And there's just the collective, like, I don't know. He should have called the election right away. I mean, the NDP should have collapsed the coalition and called an election in fucking November. And the fact this has gone on this long for what seems to be interpersonal political gain is so fucking frustrating. And at the end of the day, I think Canadians are just frustrated about our place in the world, frustrated about like what we actually have to offer, and it's sad. It's fucking annoying. I think Canadians are just annoyed. That's the best way to put it. Impotent, no guns. Their anthem whack. Hey, we got a great anthem. I love the anthem. I love the flag. Yeah, now's the time you need some real gamers in the chair, not mobile players. Yeah, we need real gamers. We need real gamers rise up to man the helm of Canada in these trying times. And I think mostly the best case I would make for Pierre Poilievre right now, and we'll see, I don't know a lot about Mark Carney. The best case I would make for Pierre Poilievre right now is that he seems most poised and well-equipped to deal with Trump in a way that, like, Trump is going to, like, mutually respect him. I don't see Chrystia Freeland having that at all. I don't see the Liberal Party in general having that right now. I just do think, like, if there's a case to be made for Pierre Poilievre, it's that, like, this is the guy to deal with Trump. But, I don't know, Pierre Poilievre pisses me off, too. I liked Pierre Poilievre a lot more before... Because Pierre Poilievre's been the head of the Conservative Party for a bit. Before Trump's campaign really took off for the 2024 election, Pierre Poilievre was just all about like lowering costs and cutting red tape to build more housing. Like that was he was almost like a single issue politician. It was all about housing, right? And which is a huge deal for me. Like housing is fucking abhorrently expensive in this country. There's no way anybody in my generation, anyone in my cohort is going to be able to afford a house with the cost of housing in this country. And to see Poilievre start taking pages out of Trump's playbook, and I'm subscribed to the Canadian Conservative email list, and seeing emails that are talking about like trans people in sports, right? Just populist brain dead arguments about things that aren't consequential in either capacity, right? To spend any length of time deliberating on trans people in sports versus all the other things you could be talking about and platforming, to me just says you're a fucking grifter. To me, it's just like you don't care. All you care about is like is the moral win and the vibes and the aesthetics and owning the libs. You have no fucking plans. So to see him pivot from a like lowercase c conservative, cut regulation, build more housing, lower the cost of living, cut spending, that sort of shit, to see him transition into an anti-woke influencer, which is basically what he's become, is so fucking annoying. Like I've lost total hope for that guy. I don't know. I have no hope for. I don't have much hope for the future of Canada right now. But we'll see. Your sovereignty unironically may depend on how well you glaze Trump. Yeah, cool. I'll be fucking against the wall, dude. Jesus Christ. Fuck all this shit. I wish we could just go back to like 2016, man. Simpler times. 2015. Simpler times, man. 2015 was a beautiful time to be alive. When I saw him dressing up like Zuckerberg and Bezos in the commercials, I knew it was over. Totally agree. I wish he actually outlined policies. Yeah, no, he just he does no policy, no beliefs. It's just anti-woke, anti-liberal. That's fucking it. And that's where we're at. So anyway, guys, fucking